Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest, James Martinez, to talk about Chicago journalism. Jim graduated from Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism during the Watergate era, which was kind of a high point for investigative journalism.
Right, it was.
And he went on to serve for 10 years as the assistant managing editor of the Sun-Times, was there during some key moments, like during the takeover by Murdoch.
Yeah.
And he's, since then, he's worked as a consultant and he's taught at Northwestern University and also at Purdue Northwest. Jim, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
What do we mean by Chicago journalism? Is there something unique about it?
The Chicago School of Journalism really isn't much of a school. It's a school of hard knocks, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's journalism kind of defined as the ultimate form of the art or the craft. Chicago journalism was more aggressive. Chicago journalism kind of set the tempo for the industry nationwide. And a lot of really interesting examples of journalism took place that were classically Chicago journalism. For example, newspapers would buy and set up businesses in order to conduct an investigation of how city officials dealt with new business owners. The mirage.
So we have a situation here where Chicago kind of had a reputation as being, you know, a little bit more corrupt during the 20s and the 30s, the gangster era, and so almost parallel to that, there was a newspaper tradition of investigative journalism that was developing, that was somewhat unique.
I think newspapers in Chicago have a long history of aggressive reporting. And then around the 70s, about the time of Watergate, newspapers in the city started to create investigative reporting teams, formal teams. I worked at the Sun-Times, and it wouldn't be unusual for some of our investigative reporters to simply disappear from the paper for 6 months because they were working on some story or another.
In the corporate environment today, I think they'd get in trouble for that.
In the corporate environment today, they would not be employed. And
Right.
in fact, they aren't.
No, they're not.
So it was a special time, and it was so special that the style of journalism that was practiced by newspapers in Chicago actually started getting emulated by TV stations in Chicago. When I was running local news at the Sun-Times, I remember assigning my night side reporters to monitor the 10 o'clock news in the city, because this may be the only city in the country where this is true, there was a chance that the TV stations would beat us on a story. I mean, that never happens anywhere. TV normally doesn't have the resources, but they did here. And it was a proud tradition that kind of fell by the wayside as industry got more corporate, as local newspapers started to vanish, and as, frankly, the business became more of a profit-driven organism than what we were accustomed to.
And you know, I mean, newspapers always had to make money to survive.
Sure.
What were they more focused on?
Well,
how would you characterize that?
They were obviously focused on selling advertising and, you know, driving circulation as much as possible. But a couple of key things happened that really harmed the printed journalism industry. The growth of the internet was a killer. The creation of Craigslist eliminated our classified revenue. And arguably back then in the newspaper days, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, newspapers would basically pay for 90% of their costs through the funds produced by the classified ad department.
Oh, the classified produced more money than the
Absolutely.
Display ads.
Display ads were basically profit.
They were more expensive.
Yes, took up less real estate though.
Yeah.
Well, they were more expensive, you know, for a large chunk.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
But you know, you were paying like $20 for 3 lines.
Yeah, that's interesting. So. That's very good. Well, let's stick with the old days for a minute here. What were the newspapers that were the leaders in this investigative era?
The ones that shined most, I think, were the Sun-Times, my alma mater, and the Tribune. The Tribune did some amazing investigative work. The Daily News had a reputation, the Chicago Daily News had a reputation for some incredibly aggressive and intensive journalism. But if you really wanted an investigative team, it had to be the two that I've mentioned. And think about some of the work that was done. You may not remember it, but the Greylord investigation that took place here.
Yeah, that was the Tribune, right?
It was the Tribune. There was a federal investigation that was named Greylord. The Tribune did an awful lot of work around it, and they were all over that story.
Yeah, the results of that were just amazing. They found corruption at the highest levels of the court system, as I recall.
They did indeed, and there was a house cleaning in the courts, in the federal courts, and I think it trickled down into county courts as well. And then, of course, the Sun-Times. I had mentioned the Mirage. The Mirage was I think a classic example of Chicago-style journalism.
It is. It's really in the trenches.
It really is.
Tell us what that was about.
The paper was trying to get a handle on how corrupt city officials were in dealing with things like liquor licenses and building permits and electrical approvals and all these other things. And so to really investigate, the paper bought a bar, opened a bar, staffed a bar for several months.
When was this?
Oh, this was in the early 70s.
Okay.
And what happened was that, surprise, the paper cast the net out and caught a bunch of people. And so they had video of inspectors who had their hands out looking for some kind of payoff in order to approve something. They had all kinds of examples like that. And after several months of operation, they shut down the bar and started writing stories. And the number of stories were impressive, and the number of indictments were even more so. And that's the kind of journalism that wasn't taking place across the country because it was considered to be a little too in the trenches.
Yeah.
But that's what happened here.
Well, Chicago manages to be unique in that it still feels like a small town in a lot of ways.
In a lot of ways,
yet it's a big
does.
city.
Yeah.
Right. We think of journalism as the fourth estate. Okay. How did Chicago benefit from this investigative trend that they were championing, and how is that lost now, and what do we miss because of that?
I think Chicago, you can say the same thing about any city that's had an aggressive media, aggressive free press.
Yeah.
But I think Chicago benefited because in an environment where people sometimes took liberties and shortcuts, journalism was there the newspapers in particular were there to keep people honest. There's an old saying about how journalism is really all about protecting the afflicted and afflicting the protected. And that certainly was the case here in the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
I think the challenge, though, that you've got is that as journalism has become a bigger business, since it's essentially become corporate, you've lost track of the local connection to the degree that we had it before. The Sun-Times has only just, once again, become locally owned. The Tribune is now been sold off.
One of them was owned by Marshall Field, am I right? Or was that
Right. The Sun-Times.
Sun-Times.
Field actually owned, Field's father actually started the Sun-Times, and then Marshall Field bought the Chicago Daily News, which had an international reputation for its aggressive foreign coverage and for in-depth reporting here. Marshall Field was obviously a businessman, a retailer, and he bought the paper because of a sense of civic commitment. He wanted a somewhat progressive voice in the city of Chicago to balance out the McCormick-run papers, the Tribune, and the Herald American, which became the Chicago Today. You knew what you were getting from both of those papers.
Yeah.
You knew that you were getting a conservative slant or a liberal slant, and a lot of people in the city would take both papers. They would read one in the morning and one in the evening.
Well, those of us who ended up studying journalism were certainly reading both of them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What a great environment that was. We were both in school, in J school in the 70s.
That's right, yeah.
And it seemed like journalists were just changing the world at that point.
Well, and I don't know what it was like in your school, but in mine, I can tell you that everybody, expected to go out, get a job, and bring down some sort of a presidential administration. That was kind of the goal in life.
Well, I was at Northern Illinois. We just wanted to get a job. We were less ambitious. Well, let's look at how the presidents were covered back then.
Okay.
So I think everybody's familiar with the Watergate story.
Sure. God, there have been so many movies about that story now.
Right.
So.
But past that, there was this. We got into the Carter presidency, and it seems like the media was just so geared up to investigate whoever was in that office that they ended up investigating really trivial things with Carter. How did you see that?
I think you're right. I think there were a lot of distractions. I would argue that Jimmy Carter was kind of the turning point for media coverage.
Yeah.
What happened, if you look prior to Nixon, reporters had a friendly relationship with the White House.
Yeah.
And generally a friendly relationship with politicians.
Yeah, there's stories about Kennedy, being able to kill stories and
right.
things like that, right?
Right, and don't forget, going back to the days of Roosevelt, reporters, photographers basically agreed not to take photographs of him in his wheelchair.
Yeah.
So when Nixon kind of changed the mindset, and suddenly we had a much more aggressive generation of reporters. Yeah. And then Carter, unfortunately, was the first guy afterward. Yeah. And he got hammered for a lot of silly stuff.
I remember they investigated his brother Billy.
Yeah.
Right? And there was an incident where he was fishing with his staff.
Rabbit.
And a rabbit swam into his boat, and he beat it off with a oar, and it made headlines all over the country, right? Yeah.
I mean, the problem is that we were distracted by those kinds of things and really didn't look at his policy recommendations or his policy positions. And arguably, in retrospect, he was the first president who advocated use of solar energy. That is kind of a progressive, smart thing to do these days. Yeah. He was the first president who was absolutely committed to bringing around some sort of a Middle Eastern peace. And in fact, Camp David was a huge success, which not many people notice. Yeah. So, I think he accomplished a great deal. But you're right. We were focused on distractions at the time because it was cool to focus on distractions. Unfortunately, ever since, we've still been focused on distractions.
Well, so then Reagan's in office, and the IranContra scandal erupts. Big investigation of that. He issues an apology, basically, his speech where he says this happened on my watch, right? And he kind of gets a pass for the rest of his presidency. And then Bush Sr. is running for office, and IranContra comes back to haunt him, and he has that clash with Rather on live TV, right? What's your take on that? That was kind of a turning point, wasn't it? Because he backed the journalists off of the story after that.
He did back the journalists off the story to some degree. What happened, though, is that story was killed by a then Assistant Attorney General by the name of Bill Barr, who basically recommended that the president pardon everyone associated with the alleged crime. Yeah. And so the story literally died overnight. If the definition of news is that we cover things that are new, the end of something that's new means that the story is over. Yeah. And it was a calculated decision. They made it. It worked, sadly.
Okay, and so, we move forward here, Clinton and Obama and now Trump. What do you think of the coverage of the Trump administration? How would you assess that?
Well, let me put it in context. I don't think that the media has distinguished itself by its coverage of any of the recent administrations. The fact that the president wore a brown suit hardly seems worth covering, hardly seems worth mentioning, and yet it filled coverage for a couple, 3 days under the Obama administration. The fact that the President of the United States tweets constantly means that we're covering tweets, or that the media is covering tweets as opposed to covering the president's policies. And I don't think that that's a service to the country. I think that I like to talk about how media tends to be distracted by the shiny object. And I think what's happened is that presidents have started to realize that all they need to do is wave a shiny object and journalists will be distracted.
Sort of like a magician. Well, do you think this is to some extent because of the influence now of television journalism and social media and things like that?
I think that plays a significant role. I mean, social media makes us all feel like we have very personalized streams of information coming our way. The fact of the matter is that it's not vetted in a lot of cases. I think newspapers in particular hurt themselves by how they kind of feared the internet and then kind of dabbled with the internet and then never really developed a real business model for the internet. But I do think that what's hurt journalism in general, more than anything else, is the corporatization of the industry. The fact that a handful of companies now control most TV stations in the country, most newspapers in the country, hasn't been good for the industry. And let me tell you why. The fact is that the standards for quality journalism weren't set by some magical, mystical body that was, that oversaw the industry from a national point of view. They were set by people in the trenches. They were set by, people at the Sun-Times and the Tribune and the Los Angeles Times and a bunch of other papers.
Through practice, almost.
Through practice.
Mostly tacitly, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they would do things that they felt good about, that they saw their readers respond to, and then they institutionalized them. And then these institutions got together and created national forums like the American Newspaper Editors Association or the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And these groups started to create national standards. What happened was that when, and these papers, it's really important to emphasize, these papers were owned locally. I mean, Marshall Field owned 2 papers in Chicago. Colonel McCormick owned 2 papers in Chicago. Across the country, the Chandlers owned the newspapers in Los Angeles. And what happened was that as chains swept in, the local control of newspapers disappeared. And that really compromised our ability to focus on bigger issues.
And enforcing standards.
And enforcing standards, I think. It's hard to enforce standards for coverage when, in fact, you're cutting an awful lot of staff. You can't maintain the same degree of, the same level of quality.
Do you think that even after the development of television news and the other things, that newspapers are still where public debate rests, that the newspapers kind of have the last word on when we're forming public consensus on big issues?
I really wish that newspapers did have the last word, but I don't think so.
When do you think that stopped? When do you think that they lost that authority?
I think that newspapers definitely lost the authority probably beginning in the late 80s and in the 90s for sure.
Well, we've both taught journalism, and one of the things I used to tell my students was that the television stations basically are covering the highlights of the stories, but the full in-depth view of what's going on is something you get from the newspaper. And even though fewer people are reading the newspaper than are watching the news on TV, it's the newspaper that ends up having the last word on things because the opinion leaders are reading it. But that's not the same anymore.
Well, it's not the same because, in fact, most people don't get the majority of Americans now are getting their news online.
Right.
I mean, that's just the fact. The number of people who read a daily newspaper every day is ridiculously tiny.
What about, reading the paper online, though, right? That's
not consistently, no. And
interesting thing, though. I, for instance, read papers online. And if I see a story I like, I'll post it to Facebook or something, right? So I almost think
God bless you for that.
well,
Roach.
but a lot of people do that. A lot of people do that. It's almost there's a new there's an extra way of getting information out now that we didn't have before. I'm not saying that it solves the problem, but I think the fact that people are reposting things is getting information to people who otherwise wouldn't have seen it.
I think that's true. I think, though, that if you look at the feeds, the people who define credible news sources
Yeah.
are not necessarily thinking of us first. I've gotten feeds from feeds online that seem like just outrageous stories until I find out what the source is, and I suddenly realize that it's not at all credible.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of garbage out there, too.
A ton.
There's no question about it. Well, let's go back to Chicago before we close here, because one of the unique things about your career is that you were one of the editors at the Sun-Times when Murdoch took it over, and that really was a key point in the dissolution, if you will, of the Chicago School of Journalism, as you call it. You know? Tell us about that.
It was an interesting time. Rupert Murdoch scared the hell out of everybody. It was a moment in time when newsroom reporters were terrified that their life's work would somehow be undermined. Because Rupert Murdoch had a reputation for coming in, cutting staff, and trashing the product.
And his products previously were basically supermarket tabloid quality.
Largely, yes. Or supermarket-like tabs.
Yeah.
And he only owned the Sun-Times for about a year and a half.
See, I don't think people realize that. Yeah, he was not there very long.
He wasn't. He really wanted the WFLD, the TV station, which became Fox Chicago. And so he sold the Sun-Times off to a different group. The irony is that Murdoch, under his year of tenure, the newsroom didn't cut staff. The newsroom maintained editorial integrity. We had some knockdown, drag-out fights with some of the editors that he brought in, but by and large, it wasn't a terrible time for the paper.
Yeah.
And our circulation reflected that. Ensuing administrations cut staff significantly in order to save money, improve the bottom line, reduce costs overall, made some bad decisions about how to respond to the internet, and the result was that the newsroom, a newspaper that had a circulation of 600,000 the day I walked through the doors for the first time, today has a circulation of about 120,000.
Well, I'm surprised it's that high, actually. I thought you were going to shock me with something. Well, getting back to the Murdoch situation, I mean, you were there when some famous people walked out of the newspaper.
Mike Royko in particular.
Royko, yeah. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Royko made a big deal out of saying that he was not going to work for Rupert Murdoch, and he walked across the street to the Chicago Tribune, which obviously made the right decision to hire him.
Yeah. I mean, he literally walked out of your door and walked across the street?
Literally, yes, he did, literally.
And was this like the day of the announcement was made about
it? It was a couple of days later, and frankly, it had all been worked out in advance. But he made a point of saying that he didn't want to work for a newspaper that wasn't good enough to wrap fish in. Because he feared what the Sun-Times would become. And what's interesting is that before he died, Royko acknowledged that it was the biggest mistake that he'd ever made.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because he was suddenly working for a newspaper whose readers had no appreciation for his brand of journalism.
Yeah, interesting.
And who, frankly, couldn't relate to the topics that Mike Royko was most fond of writing about.
Okay. Well, so an interesting trajectory here for Chicago. Just as a kind of recap here, I mean, where do you think we're at? Is Chicago any different than any other city right now when it comes to
quality of
the
journalism?
brand of journalism? Yeah.
I think Chicago, I am hopeful that Chicago journalism is actually on the upswing again. I mean, the quality of reporting that I'm seeing at the Sun-Times has gotten better than it has been in the last few years. The Tribune has gotten better. The papers are still very thin, but there are signs of life. I think there's more support. I recently had a conversation with someone about this, and I think that journalism is actually on its way back. I think that some people, having now experienced 20 years of free journalism online, are willing to pay for vetted content. And I think we're going to see a resurgence.
Well, let's end on that optimistic note. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to James Martinez for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.